The dust swirled through Copper Ridge like a living thing, coating everything in the amber grit that had become as much a part of the town as the weathered wooden buildings and the constant tension that hung in the air. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Main Street, where most folks had retreated indoors to escape both the heat and the unsettling presence that had arrived 3 days prior. Samuel "Deadeye" McCready sat hunched on the steps of the general store, his broad shoulders curved protectively around a small bundle wrapped in a faded blue blanket. His weathered hands, the same hands that had drawn faster than any man in 3 states, trembled slightly as he rocked the crying infant back and forth. The baby's wails pierced the afternoon stillness, a sound more unsettling to the townspeople than any gunshot they'd ever heard. "Hush now, boy," Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse from 3 sleepless nights. "Please, just hush." Nashi, the notorious gunslinger's face, usually set in stone-cold determination, showed cracks of desperation. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually impeccable black vest was stained with spit-up and dust. The legend of Deadeye McCready, the man who'd faced down the Dalton gang single-handedly, who'd cleared out an entire saloon of troublemakers without breaking a sweat, was crumbling under the weight of one inconsolable infant. From behind curtained windows, the people of Copper Ridge watched with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Martha Henderson, the schoolmarm, pressed her face against the glass of her boarding house room, her heart aching at the sight of the struggling father. But approaching Samuel McCready, even in his vulnerable state, seemed like inviting death to dinner. "Ain't natural," muttered old Pete from his rocking chair on the hotel porch. "Man like that with a baby. Where's the mother, I wonder?" Samuel heard the whispered conversations floating on the hot breeze. He knew what they were thinking, what they were saying. Part of him wanted to stand up, let his hand drift to the pearl-handled Colt at his side, and remind them all why they feared him. But every time he started to rise, the baby's cries would intensify, and he'd sink back down, defeated by something no bullet could solve. The child, his son, had been thrust into his arms 4 days ago by a dying woman in a saloon in Tombstone. Sarah, the saloon girl he'd known briefly 2 towns back, had found him just as the fever was taking her. "He's yours, Samuel," she'd whispered, pressing the baby against his chest. "Named him Thomas, after my father. Promise me you'll keep him safe." That promise now felt like the heaviest burden he'd ever carried. How could a man whose life revolved around violence and death care for something so pure, so innocent? Every time he looked at little Thomas's red, tearful face, he saw Sarah's eyes looking back at him, a final reminder of the one good thing he'd ever been part of creating. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting Copper Ridge in shades of orange and gold. The baby's cries had not ceased for more than a few minutes at a time in 3 days. Samuel had tried everything he could think of, walking, singing awkwardly in his rough voice, even attempting to feed the child with milk from the general store. Nothing worked. Dr. Morrison had examined the baby yesterday, pronouncing him healthy but colicky. "Some infants just cry more than others," the doctor had said, backing away quickly from Samuel's intense stare. "He'll grow out of it, given time." But time was something Samuel felt slipping away with each passing hour. The baby's constant crying was drawing attention, the wrong kind of attention. Word would spread that Deadeye McCready was in Copper Ridge, and soon enough every young gun looking to make a name for himself would come calling. How could he protect his son when he couldn't even comfort him? As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel stood up slowly, his back stiff from hours of sitting. The baby's cries seemed to echo off the buildings around him, a lonely sound in the gathering darkness. "Come on, Thomas," he murmured, adjusting the blanket around the infant's small form. "Let's find us a place to spend another long night." But as he walked down the dusty street, Samuel McCready, the fastest gun in the West, had never felt more powerless in his entire life. The 4th morning brought with it a sound Copper Ridge hadn't heard in over a year, the distant melody of a calliope drifting across the desert. Samuel, who had spent another sleepless night pacing the cramped hotel room with his crying son, paused at the window as the musical notes reached his ears. Down on Main Street, people began emerging from their homes and shops, shading their eyes against the morning sun as they looked toward the east. A small caravan was approaching, 3 brightly painted wagons pulled by horses that seemed to dance to the music flowing from the lead wagon. "Circus!" shouted young Billy Morrison, running down the street with the unbridled enthusiasm only a 12-year-old could muster. "The circus is coming!" Samuel watched from his second-floor window as the colorful procession rolled into town. The lead wagon bore a sign in faded but still vibrant letters: Professor Cornelius's Traveling Wonders and Spectacular Entertainment. Behind it came wagons filled with props, costumes, and what appeared to be a small menagerie of animals. For a moment, the baby's crying subsided, as even little Thomas seemed curious about the musical sounds filtering through the window. Samuel seized the brief respite to study the curious figures jumping down from the wagons. There was a woman in a glittering costume who began practicing handstands right there in the street, her long dark hair trailing in the dust. A thin man with an enormous mustache started juggling colorful balls while barking instructions to the others about where to set up. 2 identical men, twins clearly, began unloading what looked like an entire miniature city of tents and props. And then Samuel saw him. The figure that emerged from the second wagon seemed to step out of a child's dream. He was a man of medium height and build, but everything else about him was extraordinary. His face was painted white as fresh snow, with exaggerated red lips curved into a perpetual smile, and bright blue diamonds painted around his eyes. His costume was a riot of color: purple vest covered in golden stars, orange pants with enormous yellow polka dots, and shoes so large they seemed to slap the ground with each step. But it was something in the clown's movements that caught Samuel's attention. Despite the outrageous costume and face paint, there was a gentleness in the way he moved, a careful consideration in how he helped unload delicate items from the wagon. When a small dog, clearly part of the act, ran up to him, the clown knelt down and scratched behind its ears with such tenderness that even from his distant window Samuel could see the genuine affection. Thomas chose that moment to resume his crying, and Samuel automatically began the now familiar routine of bouncing and shushing, but his eyes remained fixed on the scene below. The townspeople were gathering in larger numbers now, drawn by both curiosity and the promise of entertainment. It had been a hard year for Copper Ridge. A drought had killed most of the crops, and the silver mine had been playing out. People needed something to lift their spirits. "Ladies and gentlemen," called the man with the magnificent mustache, his voice carrying easily across the growing crowd. "Professor Cornelius's Traveling Wonders will present an afternoon of amazement and delight. Prepare to witness feats that will astound your eyes and warm your hearts." Samuel noticed how the clown stayed in the background during this announcement, quietly helping to set up the ring and arrange the props. There was something humble about him, something that didn't seek the spotlight despite his flamboyant appearance. As the morning progressed, Samuel found himself drawn repeatedly to the window. The circus folk worked with efficient precision, transforming the empty lot next to the church into a wonderland of color and possibility. The clown, Samuel learned his name was Bobo from the shouts of the other performers, seemed to be everywhere at once, helping with everything from setting up the tightrope to feeding the animals. But what struck Samuel most was how the children of the town gravitated toward Bobo. Despite his painted face and outrageous costume, they seemed to sense something safe and warm about him. Samuel watched as the clown produced simple balloon animals from thin air, his exaggerated expressions of surprise and delight making even the adults chuckle. "Look at that, Thomas," Samuel murmured to his still crying son. "See how happy he makes them." The baby's response was another wail, but Samuel found himself rocking more gently, his attention split between his crying child and the scene of preparation below. By noon, the circus was ready. A small crowd had gathered, including families who had traveled from surrounding farms and ranches for the rare treat of live entertainment. Samuel could hear the excited chatter through his window, the genuine anticipation in voices that had known little joy recently. But Thomas's crying was getting worse, if such a thing were possible. The constant wailing seemed to be taking a toll on the infant as well. His little face was bright red, and he seemed unable to catch his breath between sobs. Samuel made a decision that surprised even himself. Wrapping Thomas carefully in his blanket and settling his hat low over his eyes, he made his way downstairs and out into the street. If his son was going to cry no matter what, perhaps the music and activity of the circus would at least provide some distraction. The performance was scheduled to begin in 1 hour, and Samuel positioned himself at the very back of the gathering crowd, hoping to remain unnoticed. But in a town the size of Copper Ridge, the arrival of Deadeye McCready and his crying baby was hardly something that could go unobserved. As the calliope began to play the opening melody, Samuel found himself wondering if this colorful distraction might somehow offer the miracle he so desperately needed. The circus performance began with fanfare and wonder, just as the mustached Professor Cornelius had promised. The people of Copper Ridge gasped and applauded as the dark-haired woman, introduced as the magnificent Sophia, performed impossible feats on the tightrope, seeming to dance through the air itself. The twin brothers, known as the Thunder Twins, amazed everyone with their daring acrobatics and perfectly synchronized movements. But Samuel barely noticed any of it. Thomas's crying had reached a fever pitch, and even positioned at the very back of the crowd, the baby's wails were beginning to draw uncomfortable glances. Samuel bounced and swayed, whispered every soothing word he could think of, but nothing helped. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the afternoon shade, and his desperation was growing with each passing minute. "Shh, Thomas," he pleaded quietly. "Please, son, just for a little while." The crowd erupted in laughter at something happening in the ring, but Samuel's attention was entirely focused on the red-faced infant in his arms. He was beginning to consider retreating back to the hotel when a gentle voice spoke behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Samuel spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before stopping short. Standing there close enough to touch was the clown, Bobo. Up close, his painted features were even more striking, but it was his eyes that caught Samuel off guard. Beneath the exaggerated blue diamonds, the clown's eyes were warm brown, filled with a kindness that seemed almost out of place in Samuel's harsh world. "I couldn't help but notice," Bobo said softly, his voice nothing like the exaggerated tones Samuel had expected. Instead, it was quiet, cultured even, with just a hint of an Eastern accent. "Your little one seems quite distressed." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd faced down lynch mobs and rival gunslingers without breaking a sweat, but something about this painted man's gentle concern made him feel exposed, vulnerable. "He's been crying for days," Samuel admitted, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "Nothing helps." Bobo nodded understandingly, and Samuel noticed how the clown kept his movements slow and non-threatening, as if he could sense the danger that always surrounded Deadeye McCready. "Sometimes," Bobo said carefully, "infants respond to different energies, different approaches." He paused, studying Samuel's face with those kind brown eyes. Would you perhaps allow me to try?" The question hung in the air between them. Samuel was acutely aware of the crowd just yards away, of the curious glances already being thrown in their direction. The reputation he'd spent years building, the fear that kept him alive, all of it could crumble in an instant if he showed this kind of weakness publicly. But Thomas let out another heart-rending wail, his tiny fists clenched and shaking, and Samuel's resolve crumbled. I don't know how," he whispered, the admission like pulling a knife from his own chest. "I don't know how to help him." Without a word, Bobo extended his arms. Arms covered in purple sleeves with golden stars, arms that belonged to a man most of the world would dismiss as a fool. Samuel looked down at his crying son, then back at those kind brown eyes. With hands that trembled more than they ever had in a gunfight, Samuel McCready, the most feared man in 3 states, gently transferred his precious son into the arms of a circus clown. The change was immediate and absolute. Thomas's crying stopped so abruptly that the sudden silence seemed to ring in Samuel's ears. The baby's red, tear-stained face relaxed, his tiny fists unclenched, and his breathing settled into the peaceful rhythm Samuel had been praying to hear for days. Bobo cradled the infant with practiced ease, his oversized hands surprisingly gentle as he adjusted the blanket and found the perfect position. Thomas looked up at the painted face above him, his dark eyes, Sarah's eyes, wide with curiosity rather than distress. "Hello there, little one," Bobo whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the circus continuing behind them. "Much better, isn't it?" Samuel stood frozen, watching his son lie peacefully in the arms of this unlikely savior. The relief was so overwhelming that his knees felt weak. But beneath the gratitude was something else, a profound confusion that shook him to his core. "How?" Samuel managed to ask. Bobo smiled, his real smile visible even beneath the painted grin. "Children often see things we adults have forgotten how to notice," he said softly, gently rocking Thomas. "They're not fooled by appearances or reputations. They respond to what's genuine." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Around them, the circus continued, but their small corner of the world had become a pocket of impossible peace. Thomas was actually cooing now, his tiny hand reaching up to touch one of the golden stars on Bobo's vest. "What's your name?" Samuel asked suddenly. "Edgar," the clown replied. "Edgar Whitman, though most folks just know me as Bobo." He glanced up at Samuel with those penetrating brown eyes. "And you're Samuel McCready." It wasn't a question. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Edgar didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of fear. He just continued to hold Thomas, continued to rock him gently. "Your reputation precedes you," Edgar said quietly, "but right now all I see is a father who loves his son very much." The simple statement broke something loose in Samuel's chest. He'd been carrying the weight of his reputation for so long that he'd almost forgotten there might be other ways to be seen, other ways to exist in the world. "He hasn't stopped crying in 3 days, Samuel said, his voice barely a whisper. I thought maybe something was wrong with him, or wrong with me." "Nothing wrong with either of you," Edgar assured him. "Sometimes we just need to find the right rhythm, the right energy. Children are remarkably perceptive. They know when someone genuinely cares for their well-being." Thomas had fallen asleep in Edgar's arms, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. Samuel stared at his son's relaxed features, memorizing this moment of perfect tranquility. "I don't understand," Samuel said. "Why you? Why does he calm down for you?" Edgar was quiet for a long moment, still gently swaying with the sleeping infant. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost philosophical, perhaps because when you paint on a smile, you remember what joy feels like. When you spend your days trying to make others laugh, you carry that lightness with you. He looked up at Samuel. "Children sense authenticity, Mr. McCready. They know when someone approaches them with a pure heart." The words hung in the air between them, profound in their simplicity. Samuel realized he was witnessing something he'd never seen before, his son completely at peace, completely safe, in the arms of someone who was, in his own way, as much an outsider as Samuel himself. Behind them, the circus performance was building to its finale, the crowd cheering and applauding. But in their quiet corner, 2 unlikely men, one feared, one beloved, stood sharing a moment that would change both of their lives forever. The circus performance had ended to thunderous applause, but Samuel and Edgar remained in their quiet corner behind the crowd, both reluctant to break the spell that had finally brought peace to little Thomas. The baby slept soundly in Edgar's arms, his face relaxed for the first time in days. As the townspeople began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the wonders they'd witnessed, several of them noticed the unusual sight of their town's most dangerous visitor, standing peacefully beside the colourful clown. But something in Samuel's posture, the absence of his usual predatory alertness, kept them from approaching. "I should probably give him back," Edgar said softly, though he made no move to transfer the sleeping child. Samuel nodded, but didn't extend his arms. "What if he starts crying again?" "He might," Edgar admitted honestly, "but that doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. Sometimes babies just need different kinds of comfort at different times." The wisdom in those words struck Samuel as profoundly as anything he'd ever heard. Different kinds of comfort. When had anyone ever offered him comfort? When had he learned to offer it to others? "You don't seem afraid of me," Samuel observed, studying Edgar's painted features. Edgar smiled, that gentle, genuine smile that somehow showed through his theatrical makeup. "Should I be? Most people are. Most people see Dead-Eye McCready, the legend. I see Samuel, the father who hasn't slept in 3 nights trying to comfort his son." Edgar adjusted his hold on Thomas slightly, his movements careful and practiced. "Fear is usually based on what we think we know, rather than what we actually see." The words settled into Samuel's mind like seeds in fertile ground. He thought about the past 3 days, about how the townspeople had watched him from behind curtains and whispered about him in doorways. But Edgar had approached him openly, had offered help without expectation of reward or recognition. "Why did you become a clown?" Samuel asked suddenly. Edgar's expression grew thoughtful. "I suppose I became a clown for the same reason you became a gunslinger. Life pushed us in certain directions, and we found we had particular talents." The comparison surprised Samuel. "I don't think those are the same thing at all." "Aren't they?" Edgar asked gently. "We both learned to wear masks, Mr. McCready. Yours is made of reputation and fear, mine of paint and laughter, but underneath we're just men trying to find our place in a world that doesn't always make sense." Thomas stirred slightly in his sleep, and both men froze, waiting, but the baby simply nuzzled deeper into Edgar's vest and remained peaceful. "Before this," Edgar continued quietly, "I was a teacher in Boston. I taught literature to young men from wealthy families." His voice carried a note of distant sadness, but when the war came, everything changed. I lost people, important people. When I came west afterward, I found I couldn't go back to that old life. The grief was too heavy. Samuel found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite himself. "One day, I saw a small circus passing through the town where I'd been trying to drink myself to death," Edgar continued. "Their clown had taken sick, and they needed someone for that night's show. I was drunk enough to think it might be amusing, but when I put on that paint, when I saw the children laughing—" He paused, his eyes distant. "For the first time since the war, I felt useful again. I felt like I was bringing something good into the world, instead of just carrying around all that darkness." The honesty in Edgar's voice was unlike anything Samuel had ever encountered. Men in his world didn't talk about their pain, their fears, their moments of weakness. They buried those things deep and built walls of aggression and reputation around them. "So you stayed with the circus," Samuel said. "I stayed with the circus. Professor Cornelius, his real name is Cornelius Murphy, and he's the kindest man I've ever known. He took me in, taught me the trade, and I discovered that making children smile was the closest thing to prayer I'd ever experienced." Thomas chose that moment to open his eyes, blinking up at Edgar with curious calm. The clown smiled down at him, making a gentle cooing sound that made the baby's mouth curve in what might have been his first smile. "Look at that," Edgar whispered. "He's got his father's eyes." Samuel felt something crack open in his chest. His mother's eyes, actually, Sarah's eyes. "She was special to you," Edgar observed, still focused on the baby. "More than I realized at the time." Samuel's voice was rough with emotion. "She deserved better than what life gave her, better than me. But she gave you Thomas," Edgar pointed out gently, "and she trusted you with him. That says something about how she saw you." The observation was simple, but profound. Samuel had been so focused on his own inadequacies, his own fears about fatherhood, that he hadn't considered what Sarah's final act had truly meant. She could have given Thomas to anyone, the doctor, the minister, any of the respectable women in that town. But she had chosen Samuel, had seen something in the feared gunslinger that he hadn't seen in himself. "I don't know how to be what he needs," Samuel admitted. "None of us do at first," Edgar replied. "Parenting is something you learn by doing, by failing, by trying again. The fact that you're worried about it means you care enough to figure it out." Around them, the circus folk were beginning to pack up their equipment. The magical afternoon was coming to an end, and Samuel felt a creeping anxiety about what would happen when Edgar handed Thomas back to him. As if reading his thoughts, Edgar stood up carefully. "Would you like to try holding him now? Sometimes a change of position helps." Samuel nodded and extended his arms, surprised by how much steadier his hands felt now. Edgar transferred the baby with the same gentle care he'd shown all afternoon, and Samuel found himself breathing more easily than he had in days. Thomas remained calm in his father's arms, though he made small fussing sounds that suggested he might not stay peaceful forever. "Walk with him," Edgar suggested quietly. "Sometimes the rhythm of movement helps. And don't be afraid to talk to him. Babies like the sound of their parents' voices, even when they can't understand the words yet." Samuel began to walk slowly back and forth, and Thomas seemed to settle at the gentle motion. "Like this?" "Exactly like that." Edgar smiled. "You're doing better than you think, Mr. Macready." And the sun was beginning to set, painting Copper Ridge in shades of gold and amber. The circus would be moving on tomorrow. They always did. But something fundamental had shifted in Samuel's world, some understanding that would travel with him long after the painted wagons disappeared over the horizon. "Edgar," Samuel said suddenly. "Yes?" "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of days of desperation, of fear, of a father's love for his son. "I don't know how to repay." "There's nothing to repay," Edgar interrupted gently. "We help each other when we can. That's what makes us human." Thomas was beginning to fuss again, but this time Samuel didn't panic. Instead, he adjusted his hold, began humming tunelessly under his breath, and continued his slow walk. The baby quieted, not into the complete peace he'd found with Edgar, but into a manageable calm that felt like victory. "You see," Edgar said, "you do know how. You just needed to believe it." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel Macready, the most feared gunslinger in the West, walked peacefully with his son in his arms, no longer the same man who had sat desperately on those store steps just hours before. He had learned something that no amount of reputation or skill with a gun could have taught him. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from inspiring fear, but from accepting help, from opening your heart to unexpected kindness, from finding the courage to be vulnerable. Behind him, Edgar Whitman began removing his face paint with a damp cloth, revealing the gentle features of the man beneath the clown. But his real smile, the one that had brought peace to a crying child and hope to a desperate father, remained exactly the same. Tomorrow the circus would move on to the next town, carrying joy and wonder to other communities that needed both. And Samuel would continue his journey as well, but now as more than just a feared gunslinger. He would travel as a father, carrying within him the memory of painted smiles and the knowledge that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. The baby in his arms cooed softly, and Samuel found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in longer than he could remember.